This is the Second Studio podcast hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bourderonnet, and the two of us are architects, partners at the office, and of course, co-hosts of this show. Today, what are we talking about, Marina? This is your show. Lead the way.
It's my show. Today we are talking about questions that...
Yeah.
Are you laughing
Yeah,
at me?
yeah.
Really?
It's good.
Today we're talking about questions that were part of a panel conversation at Georgia Tech, the School of Design, where
School
I
of
was...
Design or School of Architecture?
School of Design.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
You never trust what I say. It's incredible.
Gotta get it right.
Yeah, it's the School of Design because it includes the architecture and industrial design.
That's fine. I was just making sure you got the time.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Let's move on.
I was invited to go there a few weeks ago to be part of a panel. It was a conversation put together by a group of students, a student organization called EQiA, which means Equity in Architecture, that was created by students, I think, about 5 years ago. And they have about, I think, maybe 5 or 6 members on their executive board, and then maybe 30 members or so as part of their group.
Okay.
And every year they put together kind of like a forum conversation with panelists to kind of talk about things. So I think last year their panel was about mental health for students in architecture, because of COVID and that good stuff.
We were not invited to talk in that regard.
We're not specialists or pretty well versed. But this year was about equity in architecture and basically how you can change a curriculum in architecture school to better prepare graduating students to be working in offices.
Okay.
So there was a series of questions they came up with that are kind of around that topic. So we thought it would be good to kind of look back at those questions and maybe go a little bit deeper. The panel, the conversation was actually recorded, so they're going to put that on their YouTube, and we'll make sure we share the link with you guys. Some of those questions we didn't have a chance to talk about at the panel, so it's kind of a way here to maybe address them. And that's that. And
you want to say thank you.
I already thanked them a whole bunch. But yeah, big shout out to EQiA, all the girls who are part of that organization. They did an incredible job in putting it together. And thanks again for inviting me. I had a lot more fun than I thought I would.
Oh wow. Well, okay.
No, because I don't really do those types of things. I don't go on stage and I don't talk, do public speaking. So I was not super thrilled about doing it. But
we'll have another recording to talk about the story of the journey. And Marina's every single attempt to get out of doing this thing. But I think we should move on to the questions and the recording, right?
Wow, you're so eager.
Keep it rolling. They're losing interest.
All right, so the first question is
that's the end of the intro. So you have to say sponsors.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sponsors.
This is the Second Studio with myself and Marina, and here we go. Here's the questions. Lead us.
So there is a handful of questions, maybe half a dozen.
Okay.
Maybe a bit more than that. The first one that they came up with was, of course, what does equity mean for you, and how do your personal definition of equity relates to academia? So I'm curious to know your answer, because I already gave mine at the conference.
Equity means
having... No, you can't see my answers.
I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Equity means that people, regardless of their backgrounds, their ethnicity, their identity, and everything else, have equal access to the same opportunities as everyone else, right? And in academia, the first thing that comes to mind is admissions, that you have just as good as an opportunity to apply and get into a school, regardless of your background and regardless of the things that you don't have control over. That's what it is, right? It's so difficult to get into schools now, to colleges, and it's so expensive. So you have two constraints. One on the financial is that how are you going to go to a school if you don't have that kind of money? You can apply for scholarships and stuff like that, but clearly if you're a kid and your parents are very wealthy, you have a much greater chance of going to college because you can afford to do so without taking on massive debt, or again, being lucky enough to get a scholarship. Even in addition to how much it costs to go to school, getting into some of these programs is very difficult. And a lot of times it requires a portfolio, a high GPA, extracurricular activities. Anyone who has a kid who went to school recently, you understand what I'm saying. And if you're from a neighborhood, a city, a place where there isn't a lot of wealth and it's poor, you probably don't have access to these things. Right? You don't have access to private tutors so you can ace your SATs or whatever other exams you're taking. You don't have access to all the fancy extracurricular activities. You don't have access to a lot of stuff. And all the cards, excuse me, allergies, are stacked up against you. So when we say equity, when we talk about equity in terms of admissions, I don't think you can say, well, potential student A who's from a very wealthy family, a wealthy neighborhood, and a good school, and everything like that, right? They have the potential to apply. And the person who's from a really poor background and a poor neighborhood, and et cetera, they also can apply as easily, assuming they both have the $300 or $1,000 or whatever it is to cost to apply. That's not equal opportunity.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mentioned during the panel, was like the cost of education, and I think that's where the inequity of this world starts in this country, right? Mm-hmm. It's right there. I mean, I don't like to brag about it, and I'm not trying to brag about it, but again, like, I went to school and I pay 500 euros per year in France, and everyone in my school, my schoolmates, were from a bunch of different backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like socially, racially, sexually, like they were like probably as diverse as you could hope for. Mm-hmm. And it was just because of the fact that it was easy enough to be able to, to afford, there was a selection based on like grades and like application, your profile, but the money criteria was not really one. So it makes a huge difference. Yeah. The next question they came up with was, did you feel like your architecture education did not adequately prepare you for your career?
Any architect who's listening would be like, yes. How much time do you have?
And that was kind of like what led, I think, the panel to take place, was that a lot of freshly graduating students felt like they were not really prepared to work at offices. Mm-hmm, and mm-hmm. what I told the students afterwards is that it's something that's been talked about for years, right? Like, I mean, our generation was the same, generations before us was the same. There's this huge gap between architecture school and architecture practice.
I think that gap is widening. Generally.
Is widening?
Yeah, 100%.
Because?
Well, I don't know. I think the reasons are complicated, but I think it is widening. It obviously depends on the school, but I think as basically because construction and buildings become more complicated and everything becomes more complicated, there's just much more to know about the practice of architecture. Yeah. And even the non-architectural aspects of running a business or being part of a business, there's just a lot. There's just massive amounts of things you have to deal with every day. And so that means there's additional knowledge you need to know. And that also extends, for most students, they think about computer programs, it extends to computer programs too. And but meanwhile, the amount of time within a school for a bachelor's degree or a 4-year degree, right, hasn't changed. It's still only 4 years. It's still only 5 years.
Yeah.
So how do you acquire all this new information that professionals have to know? It doesn't fit, right?
Well, that's the tricky part, is that I think, again, because it's a creative profession, you need to build up your creative skills, right? Like your way of thinking, your creative process, learning about yourself in order to like be better at what you do, right? And that takes time. People don't come to architecture school with that already figured out, right? Yep. Like they kind of need school to help them figure that out, which is a huge task. Yes. And then it's kind of like this what we talked about before, like the two sides of the brain, right? The creative side and the technical side. Well, school is trying to kind of like touch on both, but you're not going to come out of school with both at 100%. No. Because again, it depends, like your personality, your interests, like what you are personally better at. Like some people just would never be great at technical stuff; they just don't get it. Mm-hmm. And some people are just not creative enough that they can, design things. So there is no like baseline at which everybody is going to come out of school and be like, oh, I'm like 50-50 on both. I'm good to go.
Yeah, no, it doesn't exist.
It doesn't work that way.
And also, we were talking about this in several recordings, that school is actually very, very difficult, even more difficult than practicing as an architect, in the sense that in school you have to be good at all aspects of doing a project, right? You're not diving into construction documents, but you have to be good. You do everything by yourself, even in a group project, right? You have to be good at concept design. You don't really call it design development, but developing the design. You have to be good at physical model making. You have to learn how to coordinate and print stuff. You have to learn how to get materials to build things. You have to present. You have to do the text. You have to all of those things you have to do. And if there's a technical component to the project, you have to be good at solving that too. And in practice, the vast majority of architects over a period of time will gravitate toward one of those kind of things that I mentioned. And maybe they won't be doing just that, but they will be doing that the majority of the time. They found their place. Right. School is difficult because you have to do all of it. And it's just, it's challenging in that sense. But so what are some of the things that, moments where you felt like school didn't prepare you adequately? Some of the experiences, some of the situations.
Well, I mean, one thing that maybe it's not so much an answer to your question, but I didn't know when I was in school all of the different paths that existed with an architecture education after graduating.
What are some of those paths?
Well, like I mentioned at the lecture, like we have friends who work as a developer. We have friends who write about architecture. We have friends who work for Disney and design like theme parks. We have friends who went into interior design or like other fields, and or work for contractors. I had no idea when I was in school that those things were possible. I've always heard that architecture education was great and people going through architecture school very much enjoy, the 4 or 5 year degree that they had. And it felt like it gave them a lot. But I had no idea of all the possibilities. That being said, I don't know if I would have changed my career path to not be an architect and be trained as an architect doing something else. I don't know if I would have, but I think I would have appreciated to have that on my radar. Just to be aware of it and maybe have a chance to think about it, to consider it. It's very difficult, and I think it's kind of weird. Like you graduate from school and then that's it. You got to find a job, and it kind of happens very quickly and very messily because you don't really have the luxury of time to think about like, oh, who, where, or what, right? Like it's a necessity. Like now I have to pay for myself. I have to be an adult. I have to,
shit gets real.
My parents leave me alone. Like, I got to figure shit out. So I don't have the luxury anymore.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a good point.
And maybe that's something that, and I don't, again, we can't rely on school to tell us and guide us through everything because, there's not one way to do things and there's not enough time in school to do things. But that was kind of the things that I was shocked in realizing, like over the past few years, like wow, like there is actually so many ways you could have gone about this. So that was the biggest one. I mean, there is of course other things like, okay, what if one day I want to start my practice? How does that work? How do I work with clients? Like you don't get to learn that in school because you're not put in that situation. Yeah. And you don't understand how important that is until maybe you have your own practice. Like even if you're an employee, you might not need that.
Yeah, I think those questions happen later on because most people don't start a practice when they first graduate. The things that the most common complaints are, I don't know how to apply for a job. I don't know how the interview process works. I don't know what to expect to make as part of my salary. I don't know certain programs that offices are saying I should know. I don't know the basic overall phases of a real architecture project, schematic design, DD, CD, and etc. Like I know them, but I don't really know what they mean.
I don't know what office I should apply to.
Yeah, I don't know about construction, and the list goes on. And all that is true. I mean, I experienced all the things I mentioned. I experienced that same kind of stark transition of like, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. So, and some of the things I mentioned, you wrote down. So what are some of these solutions to those?
you can't rely on school, right? So like, what are your options if it's not school? Who is the next closest thing or person that could help you but the school?
Mm-hmm.
And my first thought is the Alumni Network.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a huge network of people who just went before you through those things, and they're still like freshly out of school. They have a little bit more vision of what's happening after you graduate. And, you know, I don't know if those networks of alumni are available in schools, or if you can like, you know, request them, or even you ask a teacher, you know what, I'm thinking moving to New York or Seattle, like, do you have any alumni there I could reach out to to kind of understand like what's the job market, you know, what salary should I be expecting? Is it worthwhile for me to apply to this specific office I'm thinking of applying, or is it an awful place to work at? You know, like just basic stuff. And then the next level would be to find alumni who work in the offices you might be interested in working at, reaching out to them, asking them questions about the office, and eventually have them helping you applying there. Which, you know, some people could say like, oh, you're taking shortcuts, like, you know, you're like networking or whatever. But hey, if it works, like again, like that's why you're paying the high price of higher education is to use that network.
Yeah.
You know, it's very common knowledge in like business schools that's what's happening. Like it's like, we're networking, we're helping each other out, like we're connecting, and that's how we're moving. And I don't see why architecture school should not be the same.
Yeah, I agree. And also, it's not like it takes a whole lot of time and effort. It's just a phone call. And it's just, as a teacher, okay, I'll give you an email address. That took me 3 seconds to do, right? Well, why don't we do it? And we don't do it because it's not part of it's not the focus, you know. All our time and effort in school is just about design. Unless you're going to like a technical school or community college, but other than that, it's design. And it's almost like not part of the ethos too.
No, it's not.
You know,
but you know, as a person who like got every single of my job by myself, like I wish I had a network of people I could have reached out to help me get to the places I wanted to get, because otherwise it's much harder. Let's just face it.
Yeah, I was recently part of. I was a guest at a class, and the class was about creating a cover letter, resume, and portfolio.
Oh, yeah.
These are fourth-year students, so clearly they're going to graduate in a year-ish from now, right? And how do you put together those three things, and how do you apply to get a job? And I'm not going to get into all this stuff now, but a big part of it was you call the people that you know and ask around to understand what the context is, what's happening, to get a feel for the situations, and also, yes, to find out what an office is like and whether or not you can apply there and whether or not you have an in.
And it's like the same thing as like starting a design project, right? You do your research, you do site analysis. It's the same thing. You do your research about that place you're trying to move to.
I think that of the things that I listed that are not taught in school, I don't think it's necessary or even a good idea for a lot of those things to take up a lot of time in the education of a student.
No, I don't. I think, you know, like you could have 2 classes about how to put together a cover letter and what to expect during an interview. It could be like a 1-hour workshop or, you know, whatever, that if students who are interested in go. It's not even mandatory, you know, like.
Oh, so you're saying like a talk.
Yeah, it could be like, invite me to your school and I tell you, you know, like what you should expect during an architecture interview, and like what's important to put in a cover letter and your resume, and you know, I think like, I knew how to put together a portfolio because I had to apply to my exchange program abroad. I had to do a portfolio to be able to apply to do that.
Sure. So
I already had done that before, but like.
Yeah, it's an odd thing. I'm thinking back to my undergrad experience, and I might have missed out of opportunities because I wasn't paying attention, but I remember attending one like portfolio, you know, after hours conversation, and it wasn't particularly helpful. Now that I think back to it, I'm like, yeah, like the problem was is that the person giving the talk was a teacher.
Yeah.
Which is potentially good, but I'm like, you really want to be talking to someone who is a professional who is in that space, so they're in charge of hiring, or even a younger professional who just went through that process, and they can tell you, well, this is what I did, it didn't work, or this is what I did and it did work, you know. But it's an odd thing that these like after hours classes don't seem to take place as often as they should.
No, and to go back to like the job market, I think it's common for schools to have like job fair like once a year or whatever. And I've never been to one, so I don't really know how it works, but I'm assuming like local architecture firms will have a booth or a table or something. And
you go and ask questions, you get their business card.
Right. Which is fine. It doesn't mean that it's the office you want to be working at. So, and it doesn't mean that you want to be working in the same office as like 5 of your classmates. Like you probably want to explore other possibilities. So again,
it's hard. We should move to the next questions, but it's hard because when you are about to graduate, you know nothing about the profession. And so you have a bajillion questions. And I find it really difficult, therefore, to attend a talk and have the person who's giving the information be actually helpful.
Yeah.
Because it requires that professional, right, to zoom back to 15 years ago when they were a student, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago when they were a student, and say, okay, let me put myself in their shoes and think about what I can say to help them in their current state of mind.
Yeah.
And that's really, really, really difficult to do. And anyways, that's, I suppose, an argument for more of a Q&A kind of format. But I do want to say that it often seems like the solution to this specific question is, well, why don't we put more of this stuff in the curriculum and have more classes about it? It could work to a degree, but my philosophy has been and still is that, again, 4 or 5 years is just not a lot of time to learn what school should be about, which is primarily the fundamentals of architectural design. It's just not a lot of time for the brain to grow in that way. And so I think I don't think schools should necessarily tamper with that. What I think, though, schools should do is, they teach you about architectural design and how to problem solve, but they should be better at teaching you is how to take that skill set and apply it to other things, right? By having you actually do it, or just telling you should apply this thinking to other things.
Right.
And that's the biggest problem. Like you mentioned just a moment ago, well, if you're going to apply it at an office, what's the first thing you should do? You should do your research. You should approach it like a design project and problem solve it like a design project, because everything can be approached that way. And why not? And you have presumably, if you're a good student, by the time you graduate, you have those skill sets. So use those skill sets. But for whatever weird reason, most architecture students do not apply that skill set to other aspects of their life, including applying for jobs. And most schools do not do a good job of conveying that as a way of operating,
Well, it's also because schools are interested of the moment in school.
Schools are also very interested in what their alumni do. It's like, oh, look, so-and-so's going to the moon or whatever. Okay, well, then prepare people for when they graduate if you want them to be successful.
The next question was, what would you say are some pillars that design education should be teaching students, both broadly and specifically for the AEC industry?
Go for it. You're the panelist.
The first one, of course, is problem solving, learning how to solve problems. And again, like what you just said, like how to apply that mindset to other things. Mm-hmm. The next one, of course, is resiliency, being able to deal with uncomfortable situation and being able to adapt. And I think it's indirectly taught in school, but maybe it should be like clearly said, like, I'm going to put you in an uncomfortable situation. And the goal is to see like how you're going to react and adapt to this, Yeah,
that's an interesting point, because it's very, very strange that most of the experiences I had as a student and as a teacher and as a guest critic and et cetera, is that no one actually just says it, right?
But everybody feels it.
Everyone feels it, and all the teachers they create this like finely crafted, circuitous, confusing curriculum for you to go through, like this maze, and they're like, okay, you're going to go through this checkpoint, you learn this thing, then here. And students are like super confused, and no one just tells them, oh, by the way, this studio is an exercise, so you learn this thing. Oh. Okay, cool. Now I can understand this is the frame that we're working with. But they don't say it.
Well, that's why our students are confused by what they're learning.
But why don't they say it?
The next thing is communication, right? I think just being able to clearly explain things. And architects are often pretty good in school at explaining things through graphics. But like explaining things with words, like it's not always clear. It's not always a skilled. It's like English or whatever language of the school is actually not being taught to be applied to architecture somehow.
Well, okay, what I was going to say is that I think in school they're taught to communicate verbally to other architects.
That's my next thing.
Yeah.
Is, like you're being taught to use like the architecture jargon, right?
Yeah.
But once you start working and even working with clients, you can't explain things the same way you would talk to your peers because people just don't get it.
Yeah.
So just using like, basic words to express ideas.
Yeah, and it's not to say that the architectural jargon is not meaningful or necessary or important. Of course it is. Like partie is a word that's very important. No one understands that word except for architects. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't learn it, you shouldn't use it. But good communication is good communication. And it's very easy in an academic setting to get wrapped up in this maze of just unnecessary, convoluted ways of speaking. Like, it's just, why are you being so weird about it? Just say what you're doing. And that as a lesson, as a skill set, applies certainly when you're talking to non-architects, but it applies equally when you're talking to other architects in an office. Like, get to the point.
And I think that's also a problem of higher education in general, is that people just like using big words after big words after big words. And at the end of the sentence, the content is the same, but you could have said like much clearly.
A quick anecdote on that. When I got to grad school, I had, we did a lot of reading and writing. I'd never done so much reading and writing in my life. And I had one teacher where it was a seminar class, so we would write every week, like I don't know how many pages. And I submitted my first assignment. I've always been a decent student, and so but I got it back with all kinds of red marks. I was like, oh wow, because I fancied myself as, I did well in undergrad. I was a poor student, but also I did decent work and had some success there. And I prior to grad school, I was at this office and we won a competition, so I was like good, right? I submitted to it. It comes back with all of this red all over the paper. And she told me in the class, she's like, all of you are writing in this weird academic, dead, confusing tone. And you're using words that don't make sense. Or if they do, they're just unnecessary still. Stop doing it. And it took quite some time for most people in the class to unlearn what they learned in undergrad.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, all of us were better writers for it 100%. There was personality. I'm still not a great writer, but there was personality, there was clarity, it was more brief and concise. But it's to say that I went to good undergrad school and I worked at good offices, and
but they don't teach you how to use English properly. It's like you read a lot about architecture books and things, but it's not. The way these people write is also pretty hard to digest.
Sure.
The next thing is, of course, understanding other people and kind of like the people skill, which is not really taught in architecture school because, again, it's more of an insular and oftentimes personal experience, right? If you have like some teamwork, you might have some of that, but it's not the same thing as like understanding like who you're designing for example. So I don't know how you would go about teaching that. Maybe more sociology classes or something that's more about the people and less about the thing.
Honestly, I think like there's this idea, well, why don't we do team projects and it's going to teach students how to collaborate and work with each other and teach them how to like understand people. Most of the time, the only thing that is just really fucking frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
Because you don't have any control you're paired with. And students, they're kids, right? So like what are the chances that a fellow 19-year-old is going to be of any value or know how to communicate and be a good team? It's not, the chances are not high. But I think your answer is a good one. I mean, I would classes that are about human psychology and how people interact and how to form an argument, how to convince someone of your idea, how to listen. Like, it's not they're not easy to do, but they're not complex lessons, right? And it could be covered in a few. Fucking just let's watch a master class.
I know, maybe we should get on that. And the last one to me is like basic business knowledge, because architects are known as being the worst business people.
Yeah.
And if you look at any projects, again, like everyone working on an architecture project in real life makes more money than the architects do. Mm-hmm. So that means something's wrong somewhere, right? And I think even just like basic finance, how things work, like what's an IRA account, like how do you go about taking on a mortgage or a loan, or, just basic economics, I think makes sense. And also to understand that this is a very strong component of building architecture in the real world.
Yes.
So
I agree.
I don't love math, I don't love finances, but I wish I had an introduction to that, at some point in my life.
Yeah, and I think with some of these lessons, all of them are intertwined and impact each other, right? But it's not until later on in your professional career, most likely, is when they actually start to come to head and you start to see these relationships, and it actually starts to impact how you work and the work you do and the decisions you make. When you first graduate, it's probably not going to be the case. Like the economics of a project, unless you're going to do the developer thing and you're going a different path. But if you're practicing just as an architect or an architectural designer at an office, that's not going to impact you, right? I think that the danger is that most schools try to teach these lessons by heavily integrating it into the architecture curriculum and having students design their student projects with these factors. And I don't think that's a good idea because, again, learning the fundamentals of just architectural design, really difficult enough, right? And so what I would rather see is have these courses, these lessons, these talks and stuff, have them available, have them take place, but kind of like partition it, and say, okay, here's the stuff you're going to learn. This will be important later and it'll provide you the fundamentals for X, Y, and Z things. But don't try and just shove it into the architecture project.
Well, and but it could just be at the same thing as, again, you create the opportunity for people to know about those things and you make it available to them. It's not embedded within the curriculum, but it's an event. It's like every Thursday night, there's going to be an outsider come and do a 1-hour lecture about like any of these topics. Mm-hmm. Just so you're raising awareness on it. It doesn't need to mean that you're going to be a master at it, right?
And it
takes no effort from the school. They're not preparing the content.
Well, yeah. There's still some effort involved in money, and I would advocate for more of a seminar question and answer format rather than a big lecture.
Yeah.
Because again, the problem with the lecture is that you're assuming this professional knows how to speak to a group of 20-year-olds, and they don't. They just don't. Even for us, right, who do this podcast, and I used to teach and I'm around students every now and then, it's really difficult to remember like where their headspace is at. So seminars, questions.
The next question is, what sorts of disconnect have you personally faced when interacting with architecture firm educators or students?
Architects, educators, and students. I have more disconnect with architecture offices, the most disconnect with educators, and the least disconnect with students. I'll be honest. When I think about my past experiences and I visualize all the people I've met, I have a real beef with educators in general. Okay. So here's my rant for the day.
Says the ex-educator.
First of all, they're incredibly unorganized academics.
Well, they're functioning in a bubble.
They're so unorganized. I don't know how any school gets anything done. All the schools I've ever been around, directly and indirectly, fucking unorganized. And it is correct. It's because they operate in a bubble and they don't have, I don't know, man. There's no consequences.
Yeah.
As much as architecture offices in general are also not great at business and oftentimes a bit disorganized and unorganized and et cetera, they pale in comparison to schools. If you took the way the average school operates with their people and they were like a business, like an architecture office, would fail in like a month, even less. So there. I have major disconnect with educators. And educators are always preaching about this and that. I'm like, yeah, but you haven't practiced in how long? And you're not actually tuning into what the student's saying. You're just saying your thing and you have your shtick.
You mean having an agenda?
They have an agenda. Absolutely, yes. Or they claim that they know things about what students should do when they graduate. When again, well, no, you don't, because you haven't had to apply to a job in 50 years. You have no idea what the market's like. You don't know what programs will. So I have a lot of problems with that.
Okay. What's your problem with architecture firms?
Did I cover everything, actually? Oh, I did. Wow, look at that. Yeah. No, the problem with educators in general is that they are in a vacuum. And that's partly just the challenge of...
I just imagine little teachers in a vacuum. Sorry. Yeah.
But that's not necessarily entirely their fault, because I do think, again, there needs to be a separation between school and practice. That's the value that school brings, is that it's separate from practice. So it's I acknowledge it's a tricky thing. But my advice, I don't know if I was giving advice to educators, is like, instead of relying entirely on yourself as being the expert about things in practice, bring in practitioners, right? And bring in practitioners who, with their background, could be of value to students, right? That class that I was mentioning that I was a guest at, right? The other guest was the person in charge of first filtering out all the applicants at their office.
Oh, wow.
And she sits in at all the interviews.
Okay,
right?
So that's the person you want to ask questions about your
That's the
job
perfect
application.
person. That's the great person. Talking to a project architect is not a good person for that, right? Talking to, I don't know, whatever head partner who's not involved in any of that stuff is also probably not the right person.
Okay, so that's about educators. How about architecture firms and students?
A lot of the ones you've already kind of mentioned in this recording, so I won't repeat it. But the other that we discussed beforehand and this is a specific thing, but I think there are a lot of architecture offices who have become moderately successful to where they're financially, in the black. They are doing well and they're content and they're doing decent work.
Mm-hmm.
But they got to that point just because they were lucky and or they managed to hang around long enough, right? Because if you do decent work and you just exist for 25 years, there's bound to be some fortunate situations you can take advantage of, right? My problem with that is I don't think that is a sustainable way of operating for the profession. You cannot just keep going and rely on the marathon distance as a way to solve your problems of not having good marketing, not getting good projects, not getting good clients, not advocating for other architects, right? I mean, you can for yourself, but I don't think for the profession in the long term, it's a good thing. I think that's also partially why the profession is kind of in the shitter, is because most architects practice in that way, right?
Well, they practice in vacuum, basically.
And we hear all the time that, architecture is a profession to mature into. It takes a long time. And that's inherently true because buildings take a long time. But I don't like that and I don't really accept that as a mode of operating. Like, no, we can't do that, because then you expect any architect to wait until they're 50 before they become comfortable and have like a good salary and they're stable and they're doing good work. That's insane, right? So that's one of my biggest beefs with a lot of offices. They don't problem solve the things they should be problem solving for the profession.
And students?
Well, actually, you put two answers down, so you should answer.
I put all of the answers down. You're just ripping off my answers.
It's not true. It's not true.
Students. I mean, I don't really interact with students very much, so okay. I'm not sure if I should be the one saying that. It really always kind of like shocks me, not in a good way, when students just follow the teachers blindly without thinking, or like you see that sometimes. They're always like, I don't understand. Like, you go to like architecture pinups and you could tell like whose studio is whose, right? Because there's just a common theme going on, right? And I'm like, that's great. You probably learn some like graphic skills on Illustrator on like how to produce these documents. But also, why do you have to just replicate your students' skills on your project? Yeah. Like, this is your project. This should be your way to express your project and the teacher's way to express your project. So that kind of like always kind of like makes me itch a little bit, because I'm like, I agree. Like, and even as a teacher, like, then what? You just want to feel like you have minions replicating like your thing? I don't get it. I don't get it.
There are definitely negatives to it, which you've highlighted, but also from a teacher standpoint, sometimes it does make sense, especially in the underclassmen levels. Like you want them to focus on one aspect of architecture. You don't want them to just do their own thing because they're going to be lost. It's like, okay, no, we're looking at this thing this quarter. Focus on that. And that's also not an excuse, but a valid reason for students to be producing highly focused work. I do agree. I do agree, though, that at some point, like, you should be swimming on your own.
I mean, look, again, I wish, let's say I had like a couple classes on Illustrator on like how to know line weights, how to do drawings that just look good, but still find your way and use your own colors and your own line weights and,
sure.
Your own types of diagrams rather than just taking on, because then there is a risk for a lot of students to just use that from now on. Because that's the one thing they know really well, and they know it's going to look good, and they know it's going to work, and they won't bother finding their own. And that just, to me, is no.
Yeah, it's no. The only pet peeve I have really with students generally is if I feel like they're being lazy. Yeah. Was that the question pet peeve? I've made it into pet peeve. I don't know if that's a question.
That's pretty much pet peeve.
Disconnects. Disconnect. Yeah. I mean, disconnect with students is just not understanding because, again, as we're getting older, that gap is increasing. So I have a harder time talking to them. Hence why I tend to ask a lot of questions and critiques. But in terms of what I don't understand is when they don't put in the effort. Like that's just inexcusable.
Yeah. Okay. The next thing is, are there patterns that you've noticed that frustrate you? I've noticed these patterns, and it's mostly, I have to say honestly, based on a lot of comments I see on our Instagram account, on some of our posts, where a lot of people are like, we need schools to teach more technical skills, we need students to know how to draw like wall details, we need students to be experts on Revit, and I'm like, why? like
to get
from
hired.
The point... But nobody's going to hire a 23-year-old to go and trust them to do the wall section on a complex building. They don't know construction. It makes no freaking sense at all.
This is a good point.
And from the point you graduate at like 22 or 23 until you retire or die, if you can retire, that's like 50, 60 years of learning how to do those details well and actually maybe even see them built to understand them better and do them better. Mm-hmm. So why put that in school? Again, 4 or 5 years, not enough time. Don't put that in school. The whole Revit thing, to me, people who are like, schools should teach students how to use Revit so they're hireable. Well, no, because you know what? The way you learn Revit in school is not the way an office uses Revit.
True.
You use Revit in school as a one person on a tiny file, of one house with 3 windows and 2 doors, and you don't do like permit drawings. You don't have consultants jumping in the model and doing their part. Yeah. Like you don't know the workflow, and the workflow is very much proprietary to the office you're working at. So the best way to learn that is when you first started working at the office, there is a BIM manager or somebody who's going to show that to you.
I think the answer to both of your points, which I agree with, is internships, right?
Yeah, get familiar with those things.
Right.
Don't be an expert at it yet.
Internships in the summer, right, is not distracting from school.
Yeah.
And you're filling in your vacation time. Who needs vacation? With learning these things.
Yeah.
And actually that is a perfect example of what I said earlier with having these things, but partitioning it, right? You don't allow this other important stuff to distract and take away from the essential stuff, which is design thinking, and you don't just try to shove them in together. Like, how many times, for people listening, did you experience a studio or professional practice class where you're learning about sustainability in wall sections? Okay, everyone draw a wall section and show me how like your building is sustainable because you're doing these technical things. You're like, okay, well, I'm a 3rd year or 2nd year. I barely know how to like do a proper site plan and a floor plan. And now I'm like drawing a detailed wall section with stuff I don't understand. And there's this like whatever solar technology and things like that. Like sustainability you should be worrying about like mass and orientation and openings at that point. But the technical stuff is shoved in there because there's professional practice. We have to do it. Oh, great. Now you learned about professional practice. It's like so dumb.
Yeah.
It'd be more worthwhile for you to learn how these things are actually used in a real office, even if it's a short-term period like an internship. And you were correct that no office is going to rely on like a 22-year-old.
No, that's not what they're hiring you for. They're going to hire you to do the renderings.
The thing, this might be a tangent, but Look, if you were to design a school and the primary objective of the school was to make students who, when they graduate, are the most ideal candidate to be hired, even more specifically, so they can be productive employees day one when they start, then yes, you would learn Revit from day one in school. You would learn about technical stuff. You would become a production person, because that's the easiest part. That's what we think of when we think of like contributing to an office and being a productive employee, is production. They can produce drawings. You understand construction, right? But that's a really big if. That's if that's your objective. But that is not the objective of most schools, and nor should it be. Because, and this gets back to the larger perspective of what is the purpose of school versus of the profession. The school exists, yes, to prepare students, but the school exists to challenge the profession. And so if those two are too much in sync and all you're doing is creating a pipeline into the profession's not going to evolve, and you're not going to produce people who are ever going to think outside of the box, produce people that are going to do something different or think on their own. Not going to happen. You've stunted professional growth.
Yeah. Another thing that is a pattern that I've noticed that kind of like makes me question everything in general is that as we, get approached by potential clients or talk to anyone related to the field in the general public, people actually do not know what architects do.
Sure.
And it really puzzles me because I'm like, well, when a future client asks you like, oh, do you design interior spaces as well? And we're like, well, we don't just design facades.
Yeah.
Like, we design streets, we design public spaces too in some ways, right? With the way the buildings are interlocked with the urban fabric and all of those things. And I'm like, again, that comes back to the communication skills. And it means that somewhere the practicing architects are not doing a good job at telling people exactly what it is that we do. Or maybe that we let media tell people what we do, or other profession close to ours telling people what we do. And that's kind of a big issue to me. And that's what I said at the lecture. I was like, anyone in this audience, you're graduating, your mission is to tell everyone who's not an architect what an architect does.
Yeah.
Because that's also why the profession is struggling. I think people don't understand the value of the things that we can bring to society.
Yeah. It's a fact.
Yeah,
People don't know. Talking about what's taught during school, and this goes back to problem solving in a way, and you had written down, we had talked about learning how to be uncomfortable. That's a big part of design, is problem solving and being in a state of discomfort, but being okay with that. And knowing like, I don't have the answers, and it's annoying I don't have the answers. I might never have the answers despite me having to finish the project, but I'm okay with it. And I'm gonna float in this like uncertainty until I find like what I think to be the best solution, but it's going to take time. And when I find the solution, it's going to open up more questions. I'm going to be uncertain again about other things.
And I think that's kind of the common thing within any creative profession, right? You're an artist, you're a writer. You're a writer, you have an idea about a topic you're going to be writing. You don't know exactly what words you're going to be using, right? And you have to be comfortable not knowing exactly what word or rewriting the words you wrote, right? Like it's just it's part of the job. That's part of what creation and design is. That's what it is. And I think that also comes back to like, people pushing on technical skills. Is I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable being uncomfortable, and therefore they're trying to latch on to something that they know really well to find some security and safety in that.
And that can apply to anything. It can apply to a way of designing or a style that the teacher has. I'll do that. I mean, they do it, right? Yeah. And I like them. It applies to skill sets. Oh, everyone says I need to know Revit. Okay, I know Revit. Okay, good. I know Revit. I feel safe. Yeah. But so what I was going to say is that I think the biggest lesson really that design school teaches you is you learning how to educate yourself, right?
Right.
So teachers are educating you, yes, but the biggest thing is they're teaching you how to teach yourself.
Yeah.
That is, you have to, by yourself, look at a architecture problem and solve it, right? But that, as a mindset, should be applied to other things as well.
And I think in some ways that's why school should not give you everything you need when you graduate, right?
It's not possible.
well, at first it's not possible, but also they probably should not, because then otherwise they're avoiding you from growing on your own.
You have to learn how to put yourself in certain positions. First of all, you have to learn how to be open to finding solutions and doing research. And you have to learn how to put yourself in situations where you get good information and then go from there. And if you take that away from a student, then that's the real biggest. We can't spoon feed them. That's the thing.
That's the issue. The next question is that how important do you think interdisciplinary education is early on? I think it's pretty important. I don't think it should happen too early because, again, as we mentioned, like the first few years, you're just kind of trying to understand what you're there for and what architecture is and how it all works. And I think if you kind of like throw in the mix someone from like another major or something to do work with, it's kind of like, okay, I'm trying to understand my stuff, now how to understand your stuff while still looking at this project. Like that's kind of a lot. So I think like, you know, mixing disciplines is great. I think there is a time and a place for that to happen in school. That's probably not super early on.
I think that's a good point. I remember in my first year and might have been first quarter or second quarter, we had to do a project with different majors who were in related fields, engineering, I think. And it was just really difficult because, I think in that case, the purpose of everyone mixing was more so that they try and have a common basis between the engineering and architecture, which I agree with. But it was very difficult because none of us knew anything. And so, and this is the case with many group projects, you end up having not a synergy between the different team members. You end up having more of a like the lowest common denominator. The easiest path is what's going to win. Because I don't know enough to formulate my arguments and to say, well, I think it should be this way for these reasons. And they don't either. So we just kind of default to like, okay, well, who wants to do it? I guess I just do this. You know, I think it's hard to get the most out of a collaborative project if people don't know their stuff, at least at a basic level.
Yeah, no, it's hard. I mean, I think, you know, mixing people together makes sense. I think maybe one way to warm up is to do like team projects within architecture first to kind of get used to working with people.
I agree.
And then move on to like bringing on, you know, students from other majors. I do wish, and oftentimes it's, you know, like architecture are paired with engineer students because somehow they're the easiest to pair on campus. But it would be super cool to see pairings such as, I don't know, architecture and landscape architecture students, you know, which very much happens in the real life. So why not in school?
That's I don't know why at my school we never did that. We have a landscape, we haven't had a landscape architecture program. We never had interaction with those students. I'm like, why?
Or even, you know, the architecture and interior design programs, you know, they're often kind of like not looking at each other. It's like, why? And then I think the next one would be like construction management, and maybe that's more specific, and maybe that's more part of like a bigger team of mixing students. You know, like let's say you had a competition the school was organizing, and you had an architecture student, like almost like a mock-up project, right? A mock-up team, an architecture student, an engineering one, a landscape or interior design, and a construction management, and they're all working on a project.
You know what I would do? I mean, I have no idea how this would work, but instead of, I always had the problem in school when I was paired up with another major. I'm like, I don't trust you. I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're a good landscape person or whatever. I think I did have interact with a landscape architecture student once, but I was like, I don't know if you're a good student or not. I don't know if you actually know your field. I barely know my field. I don't know anything about yours. It might be more interesting for students to interact with professionals or teachers from those departments. Yeah. Because you can trust them. It's like, okay. And also they'll be more sensitive to the student and whatever else. That might be more like impactful. If I think back when I was a student with an architecture project, I would have been much more inclined to collaborate or get feedback or whatever from a landscape architect professional, a good one, rather than a landscape architecture student. Like, why are you pitting two amateurs next to each other?
Yeah, that's true. Okay, the next question is, we can all agree that equity, justice, and climate change are heavily affecting our society. What are the necessary skills and knowledge that emerging professionals need to have to tackle these issues? What?
everything. What kind of question is that? It's a massive question. What was your answer to this?
My introduction to my answer was like, well, I think it's unfair to put that on like all of the youngest generation. It's like, oh, I'm older, so I'm counting on the young kids to figure it out for me.
I agree.
And I'm like, this is such a cop out. Like, come on, like you're just refusing to participate and just putting that on somebody else's shoulder, and that's just not cool. Anyway, I think the skills that would be required would be awareness, being aware of all of these issues, and as we talked about, the two of us, like those younger generation are very much aware of all of those issues.
Because they have to be. It's in their face all the time.
If so, maybe too much aware at some point, which, you know, it's kind of whatever. I think the other thing to understand is that everybody needs to do something to address those big challenges. And it's not because, you know, one person is leading a huge effort that means less people need to participate. I think we kind of each have to find our ways to infiltrate those challenges and do our parts. It's not going to be one person resolving all of these issues. It's going to be a collective effort. Yeah. And what I said at the lecture was that the first thing we can all do to make sure that those challenges don't happen again or don't other challenges happen is just be better people. Like if we were all trying to be better people, none of these things would have happened, you know. So that's kind of I think the big thing. The other thing is, of course, to be optimistic and resilient. You can address big challenges if you don't think it's possible to change them, and if you can't make it through, there's going to be bumps, and you just kind of have to keep going.
Yeah, I think also you mentioned everyone kind of needs to do their part, right? I think this is true, but realistically, and I think this is something that architects, people learn after they graduate and they've been in the real world for a period of time, that the power to inflict change only happens if you have power.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's no substitute, right? Like power is power. And as much as everyone, is going to talk about these things amongst themselves and group stuff, it's fucking meaningless unless you have people who have the same intent and integrity and skills and whatever else, and their positions of power, right? And architects, kind of by definition in their role, are really kind of powerless people because we're a service industry. I don't like thinking of it that way, but in some cases, in some ways, it's absolutely true. There's the client, they have all the money and all the final decisions. There's the build, there's like many other things involved, and there's the economy. I think we're powerless. There's the regulations. We don't have control over that. So architects have very, very little power. And if we want to address these problems at a bigger scale, then we need more power. It's really that simple, right? So organizations that have the capacity and the influence to talk to people of influence who have the control over the things that I mentioned, or architects to just go become those people, which I've said many times before.
Yeah, we need more people with architecture training who go advocate for architecture, in those specific global challenges, right? Like, how do you change the society? Well, you change it by the built environment. How do you change the built environment? Well, by the policies you put in place, by the regulation, by giving equity in the way people can access housing and all kinds of things like that. So
it's sort of like if you're a carpenter and you work with wood, right? And there's a carpenter's organization or school, and everyone's like, we should be more mindful about the type of wood we use so it's sustainable. That's like the conversation. But what do we do? Well, everyone you can use sustainable wood. Okay, fine. That might help, but there's going to be a lot of situations where you can't because of the budget, because of the client, because of whatever. If you actually want to reduce the amount of times, reduce the amount of unsustainably sourced wood is used, then you can't just operate as a carpenter. You got to do more than that, right? Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm saying. I think recognizing our limitations, as an architect and just an architect is a very important thing.
The next thing is that I don't think we need more star architect.
Okay. What does that have to do with?
There is this weird thing with architecture school with in some indirect way, it's always kind of like trying to shape like the next big architect, right? Like we're expected, and it goes back to like all of the different fields architecture students can end up working with. There's this thing that architecture school is kind of like fostering students to become designers.
Okay. Confused by this. This seems like the antithesis of everything that I said, and I don't understand what your definition of our starchitect is.
A starchitect?
Yeah. What do you mean by starchitect?
Well, the 0.001% that becomes that design iconic buildings.
Why don't we need more of them?
We need more better base architects to do a better job at the buildings that nobody takes photos of, so the built environment is better.
Okay, so it's not necessarily we don't need more starchitects, we just need more good architects.
We don't need more starchitects.
It seems to be that you're focused on the starchitects, though. What do you have against starchitects?
Because every single student who goes to school and does project, or the project that they design, they think that that's what they're going to build after they graduate, right?
Yeah, fine.
Which might happen, but I think there is a non-existent interest in just doing just good basic architecture.
Oh, I see.
I
see. Yes. I see what you're saying.
The value is put into who's going to do the most iconic, spectacular building for their, semester project. And it's no, it shouldn't be that. It should be, and that goes back to the, Mark Lee's quote, which is I don't want my students to do the best work in school, which means maybe don't do the most iconic buildings in school, but try to do the best, most basic buildings in all of the best way possible.
In school?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm
saying. I think you lost your train of thought. But I do get what you're saying, though. Your argument is rooted in the observation that the problem is that we have very iconic, cool buildings, which are great to have and we need them, but we're lacking in, again, the 99% of the buildings are just not good, right? And therefore, maybe in school, there should be more attention given to producing really high quality architecture and perhaps less attention to producing capital A iconic, culturally changing
monuments.
Architecture.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I feel about that.
And I'm not saying it's one or the other, I'm saying the students should be able to dab into doing both. But
I think you're onto some...
I think it's a fundamental thing to understand that, well, first, we're not all going to be designing monuments, and we need to be good at designing good buildings in general.
I think actually this might be another conversation, but one of the more interesting questions about education rather than technical things, right? Yeah. Because talk about skill sets that students lack when they graduate. The technical stuff, obvious, fine. But the ability just to produce and draw, even from the outside, a building that is more likely to get built, right? So it belongs to the 99% of buildings category. You're not producing a big, fucking crazy hovering spaceship, but it's a building. But it's really, really well done, and it's beautiful, and it serves all the programmatic requirements and everything else, and does a bit more than that even. That skill set does not exist in most students, right?
I mean, basic good floor plan does not exist in most students.
Okay, I get what you're saying now. Yes.
That's basic good architecture is you don't have to do a conventional bathroom in your floor plan. That's not what I'm saying. You could be extremely visionary and forward thinking, but just the understanding of space, the understanding of proportions, that kind of understanding, rather than the big sculptural gesture that a building can have and the cool things you can do in Rhino and 3DS, this is stock architecture training to me. That's not just good basic architecture training. And I feel that's something that a lot of students and schools are lacking more than maybe our generation was. And that might be because of the influence of technology, kind of pushing things in one direction versus the other. But in school, we learn how to draw floor plans. We learn how to draw facades. We learn how to understand proportions of buildings and flow and light.
Speak for yourself. I was part of the Starchitect training.
But I've been in studio here in the States where it's a completely different approach, and it's all about form and shape. And
I think a clearer distinction would maybe be more about understanding a building realistically versus just form making.
Yeah.
And that I agree with.
And that taps maybe more into the technical aspect of architecture, which is more.
I don't think it does. I mean,
I don't know.
I don't think it. I don't think it does. No, not in my mind.
Well, in some ways, you do a good floor plan. It's technical because it's more rational. It's more thought of, but it doesn't mean it's technical. Like, what block size and stud size I should be using. Like, no, it's not.
Right. This is true. Then I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, and it's previously I was saying learning some of the economics, how to run a business, how to form an argument, how to building codes and all that stuff. Like, learn it, but don't shove it into design studio necessarily. I don't apply that thinking here. Like, learning how to do just a fundamentally good building is a perfectly fine thing to learn, and you should be learning it, and it should be in the design studio. It's tough. I mean, I always tended to think in the more conceptual sense. I'm very conceptual in that way. I always was as a student, but there should be opportunities where you just hone those design execution skills. Okay, I have a cool idea. How do you actually do that, though, right? Without relying on crazy forms as a way to circumvent.
And I come from a different background where, architecture school in France was extremely rational. Things had to make sense. They had to have some kind of reality component to it. Like, you were not allowed to dream too big, in the sense that it was like utopian architecture and like nonsensical. Mm-hmm. So, I kind of have a foot in both, which I think, it would be good to implement.
I think these are really good points. I mean, how many students graduate and they I don't care about the construction technical aspects, because like, you're going to learn it, It doesn't take long to learn. I mean, it does, but like, doesn't take any magic recipe to learn it. You just fucking learn it. But the ability to draw a good floor plan and do a good facade, that I'll be much more worried about if I were hiring someone. Like, if you can't do that, then I don't want to have to teach you design. I mean, that'll be part of it, but there should be some fundamentals.
That's 99% of the buildings that we experience every day. So,
True. True. So the next question is, looking at the curriculum, how would you suggest that this can adapt to be more proactive to current global challenges?
Yeah, that's $1 million question.
Do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, go for it. I've been talking too much.
I think what schools should do a better job at is giving students the opportunities to apply their own problem-solving skills and their own interests to do something. Give them opportunities so they can make their own initiatives to do whatever it is, right? Because when you graduate, you don't have that structure of a class. You don't have an assignment. You don't have a quarter system. You don't have a teacher. You don't have peers. You don't have any of that. You're by yourself. And if you want people to graduate and be successful within the career, within the profession, but then also go off and do these greater things of solving equity and climate change and whatever, what you need are people who are good at problem solving, smart, and they will take initiative on their own, right? That third one is huge. If you have the skills and the talent, but you don't take initiative, meaningless. And the problem with a lot of schools is that they focus on the first two, but they don't focus on initiative, and they don't give opportunity for initiative. More specifically, this ties into design studios that are hyper focused, where it's a step-by-step process to do this project. Zero initiative, right? Uh-huh. Zero creativity also, but zero initiative. And so how do you expect a person, when they graduate, when they have these skills, to go off and start their own foundation, to go off and join a foundation, to go off and talk to their city council, or to do whatever it might be, right? You haven't given them the opportunity for them to even think that way on their own. And so I think schools should be much better at that. I was lucky in that I happened to be surrounded by teachers and mentors when I was in school who were pretty good. Actually, some of them were very good at kind of always poking me and saying, go do this thing. And, I'm a student. I'm like, I got my own studio stuff to work, but why would I go and do this competition or go and apply for this thing? No, go do it. Go do it. Nah, I don't want to. Have you done it? No, go do it. Okay, fine, I'll do it. And in that case, they were much proactive, right? And then not just giving an opportunity, but almost forcing it. But that was the best thing, because then it taught me a new set of problem-solving skills, and also that way of operating in the world. Schools needed to be better at doing that.
You know, when I went to study abroad, I was like, I used to be the kid that never liked being away from home, right? Mm-hmm. And I went to study abroad. And that's the best thing I've ever done, you know? And I think just explaining to students and pushing them in doing things that maybe they think they would never do, mm-hmm. or that they were not cut for, or that, you know, like they wouldn't think of, is the best kind of education, because it opens just so many doors and so many possibilities, and you know, creates a bunch of new interests.
And it's really hard because, you know, there's two sides to education. One, you have to impart knowledge to the individual, and they have to learn things, right? Facts, like knowledge-based information, and they have to learn how to think, the more conceptual aspects. But the other half of the education is getting them to be inspired completely on their own. And that's very tricky to teach, but it needs to be attempted. And I don't know, like, if you have a student who's very good at has good skills, but they have zero interests of their own, well, that's a huge problem, right? It's sort of like if you raise a kid and you're just telling them what to do all the time. Eat your vegetables, eat your vegetables, eat your vegetables, do this, do this, do that. And you never ask the kid, like, hey, what are you interested in doing? Like, what is your passion, right? And obviously, if they're a little kid, it's difficult. But as they get older, okay, go for your interests, right? If you don't allow that to take place, and I don't know what we're producing. People for the workforce, I guess. I don't know. You
know. What do you foresee the next challenge being? I wrote down that, you know, one might think that AI is the next thing, because it's kind of like a hot topic at the moment. Yeah. Which it ultimately comes back to technology. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting to look at technology and the way it's evolved over the years, and look at architecture and see the way it did not evolve over the years as fast as technology, right? And as we were alluding to, how technology is kind of like stirring the profession in one direction, and if this is a good thing or a bad thing, and how to be able to use technology in what we do in a more meaningful way than just using it as a very powerful tool without much critical thinking behind it, mm-hmm. you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. And AI is something we'll dive into in another recording. It's probably its own rabbit hole of conversation. I think, what was the question? Challenges. It's tied to technology, the thing I have to say, which is there is this over focus on maybe the speed and efficiency of architecture through the technology, mm-hmm. rather than asking the more fundamental questions of, like, why we should be doing this, and is it of good value in the largest sense. That's basically it in a nutshell. Yeah. The next question is, how should the pedagogy of school actively be changing to teach the next generation of architects? I think we answered a lot of it.
We did that.
The one thing I would say, though, is that I think school should be very difficult. School should be challenging. School should push students beyond their comfort zone 100%. School should require students to work insanely hard and be dedicated and passionate. However, school should also be structured where students understand a line between all that and being taken advantage of. And this is a difficult thing, because when you are that dedicated as a student, and let's say in this scenario, you're pulling all-nighters all the time, right? It creates a pattern of behavior, not just a working pattern, but a pattern of thinking of how it's okay to be, right? That is not healthy. Because when you go to work for an employer, you're okay with doing that, right? And that's not okay, unless you're being paid for it, which you're not going to get paid to work all night, generally, for most offices.
No, you're not. And it's also not good for your own health.
Yeah. That's one of the biggest problems with schools, I think, that somehow, again, this balancing act between the two sides.
The last question would be if we have any advice for the next generation of professionals.
Listen to the podcast. Go ahead.
My advice is trust your guts and take some risk. I think that's probably the best time to do that. Take risk is when you come out of school. You have absolutely nothing to lose. You have everything to create. You're starting blank, right? The world
is your oyster.
Is your oyster, man. No, it's true. Like you could do anything. You could go, hopefully you could go anywhere, right? So I would say it is time to do something crazy, like dream big, right? Yeah. You're not going to do that when you're like 42 kids and a mortgage. That is just going to be a bit more complicated, right?
Yeah.
If you are, probably would not recommend it as much. But come out of school and just go do something. Please do not go work for a local office where your school is at.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Go see, the world is a big place, like travel, go do, I don't know, like humanitarian work in architecture for a month or two and then come back. Like just go experience stuff. Experience as much as you can. You're still in like the learning and absorbing mode of being a student in school, but you're now in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So just keep being that sponge and go see things and do things.
Interesting. I have two pieces of advice. The first is longer term, and the other is more like immediate short term. And the immediate short term one is that similar. Did you say trust your guts or instincts? Similar to that, if you're in a situation in an office, let's say, or talking to someone, and what they're saying doesn't make sense to you, then ask them to explain it. And if it doesn't make sense to you, but it's not the right time and space to ask, why, then just don't trust what they're saying and continue to question it and call our hotline. Because I do find that a lot of younger professionals, like they're pretty smart people and they have good common sense. And it is remarkable, I think, to students, they would find it remarkable how much just good common sense goes. It goes a long ways, right? And there's this belief, this person's older. They've been practicing for 15 years, for 30 years or whatever. What should I do here? What should I do? And they tell you their advice. You say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. No, don't just go with whatever they say. If it doesn't seem right to you, then say it doesn't seem right or don't listen to it. A lot of offices suffer from being bad work environments because they have bad leadership, right? And their younger employees just kind of go along with it because they think like, well, I don't know anything about working in an office. So if they're doing it this way, then it must be the way that it should be done. No, if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is it's very difficult, but think about your life and your career in the long term as much as you can. I mean, you don't have to like have a plan that's written down and then like only follow that plan. I think being sort of a wanderlust is important, but have it in mind because from the time you graduate of like 23 to when you're trying to have kids, which is basically the big mark for most people, it goes by very quickly. And you really need to think about, you need to have it in the back of your mind because that requires a lot of things in life to be set up. If you want to be comfortable and like secure about it and not just fucking wing it and see how it's going to work, which is not a good strategy if you're in architecture because it's difficult to do. So think about your career, the long term, both for the career, but also for your own life.
My last advice would be to remember that you're not alone, right? Architecture is a big community. And I think the community is more and more a community right now than it was before. And I think it's okay to ask for help. I think it's okay to not know things. I think it's okay to talk to other architects. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think that change is happening.
Like, I don't think when I graduated from my school that I thought about architecture as a community. I don't think I thought about reaching out to, classmates or people who are in my school after I graduated, mm-hmm. To ask for help or to ask questions or, to be a resource. I think it's happening more and more now, and I'm very happy to see that. But I think it just needs to keep going. Can't stop.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'm kind of confused by this topic. So were we talking about equity or were we talking about like, sustainability or both?
Sustainability?
Well, global climate crisis, I think came up, didn't it? Or did it make that
global challenges? Well, it's kind of like, the things that the profession is facing.
Right.
And society in general.
Oh, man, big topics.
Big topics. Oh, yeah. Those are big questions, but I think they're good to ask. And again, kind of have a dialogue and have conversation happening. And I'm sure a lot of students would identify to these topics, and a lot of educators might find some interesting things to, think about, hopefully.
Or they're going to be like, who are these two schmucks telling us what to do when you don't know anything about educating students? I've been educating students for 50 years.
Yeah.
Okay. My hip hurts.
But I do want to give a shout out to the students who put together those questions for their panel, because we kind of use that as the basis of this recording.
Of course.
So, again, good job putting all of that together. And I hope that we were able to add on to the conversation that happened, a few weeks ago.
Be optimistic is another one.
Outro.
Okay. Thanks for listening to this recording. If you like it, then you can support the show by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube, where you can subscribe and rate or like or whatever. All of the episodes are on our website, which is secondstudiopod.com. Not all the episodes have video components. So if you're on our YouTube channel and you're like, where are the rest of the episodes? They're on the website in an audio format. You can also find us on all the social medias. We're mainly on Instagram on there. We got a good following, so feel free to comment and start a conversation about this recording or others that you see. And lastly, we have the hotline and email. The hotline is 213-222-6950. Text it or leave a voicemail for any questions or suggestions. And the email is hello@secondstudiopod.com. Anything else?
Did you mention the hotline? I'm kidding.
I mentioned the hotline, yeah.
That's it. We have a lot more coming your way. Please keep subscribing, listening, share it, and we'll talk again.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.